Hello, this time on Sitrep.
She says, haven't you heard? The war's over.
A very great crowd is collected already. Thousands upon thousands of people gathered to share this historic day with the King and Queen.
We revisit our history lessons to see how we can best use them 80 years on.
In a low voice he said, General, with this signature the German people and the German Wehrmacht are delivered into the victor's hands.
Long live the cause of freedom. God save the King.
It's a poignant moment for us to acknowledge the freedom that we enjoy and how we have to protect that and nurture it, especially with Ukraine.
How did the Allies secure victory in Europe? What did they get right and wrong along the way? And with 8 decades of hindsight, as the continent faces its gravest threat of a return to war, did we do enough to win the peace? If not, then can we yet fill the gaps?
Sitrep with Kate Chabot and Professor Michael Clark.
War is grinding and brutal. By the spring of 1945, Europe had suffered 4.5 years of death and destruction. But war often eventually ends nearly as rapidly as it begins. Mike, those final days that ultimately led to Germany's surrender, some of the most momentous in all of history.
Yes, it went from March until May the 8th. Because in March, the Allies in the West, they crossed the Rhine in several places at once over a couple of days. And because they were across the Rhine in lots of different places, Germany was literally in a state of collapse from the middle of March onwards. And of course, the Russians were closing in. They'd had some very tough fights in Poland during February and March. And then they were closing in on Berlin. And on the 30th of April, Hitler committed suicide. And then there were a whole series of things happened on the 2nd of May. There were some surrenders. Then on the 4th of May, surrender in northern Germany, northern France, but overall German forces. Then surrender in Italy. Over 1 million men surrendered in Italy on the 4th of May. And then the surrender was 2:30 in the morning on the 7th of May. And then another surrender to the Russians at 11 o'clock in the evening on the 8th of May.
In the small hours of this morning, May the 7th, 1945, I saw the formal acknowledgement by Germany's present leaders, military leaders of their country's complete and utter defeat by land, in the air and at sea.
Thank goodness that's over. Let's get on with life.
This is the BBC Home Service. It is understood that in accordance with arrangements between the 3 great powers, an official announcement will be broadcast by the Prime Minister at 3 o'clock tomorrow, Tuesday afternoon, the 8th of May.
We were at Celle in Germany, and we were all in the cinema, I remember that, and we were watching this film. The door burst open and all the lads shouted, shut up. And he said, I've just come to tell you that the war's finished. And the whole place erupted then, of course, and it became a great party.
We was on duty and one of the Scots girls came in and she was going, everybody in the world's celebrating my birthday. So I said, Paulie, what are you on about? She says, haven't you heard? The war's over.
Buses covered with people standing on the roof, just going balmy. Not necessarily due to drink or anything of that nature, but definitely they were letting their hair down.
We may allow ourselves a brief period of rejoicing. Advance Britannia. Long live the cause of freedom. God save the King.
That was how the news of victory in Europe unfolded and the memories of some of those who were there. But the real lessons come from how the Allies got to that point. So joining our class today, we welcome Dr Meghan Kellegher, historian and academic access manager for the RAF Museum. Meghan, welcome to Sitrep. We just heard from some of the few still with us who can remember VE Day. Preserving those memories, but also passing them on remains so important, doesn't it?
It really does, and thank you for having me. And I think that's something that's really important and something that we've seen more widely in the media in the recent days, that there is still very much this interest in victory in Europe and remembering that past. And that's not just in the United Kingdom, it's across the world.
And Meghan, where do you see the Allied path to victory in Europe beginning? Is it D-Day? Is it the invasion of Sicily a year earlier or something else?
I think it's something that kind of builds up over the course of the conflict. We can arguably go right back to things like the Battle of Britain or the blockades that naval forces did from the outbreak of the Second World War. All of these factors do come in to play. And of course, we are celebrating the 85th anniversary of the Battle of Britain later on this summer.
And Mike, what do you see as the Allied path to victory in Europe? Where did it begin for you?
Well, the big swing back began at Alamein in October 1942. Until then, Britain had been holding on. And the war changed during 1941 with the creation of the Grand Alliance. Hitler attacked Russia in June 1941. And then crucially, of course, Japan attacked America in December 1941, Pearl Harbor, the 7th of December 1941. And, Churchill said on the 7th of December in Pearl Harbor was the 6th of December in Britain. It was a Saturday night in Britain. And Churchill was at Chequers. And when he heard the news, he said, I knew then that we had won the war. Because the Americans were with us. He said, I knew at that moment we had won the war because the Americans, he said, are in it now. They're up to the neck and into the death. Those are the words he used, up to the neck and into the death. And he said, and whatever was to happen, however bad it would be from now on, I knew that we had won the war. And he said, I went to bed that night and I slept the sleep of the saved and the grateful, which indeed he did. And that was the turning point. But that turning point wasn't felt until Alamein in October 1942. And after that, and Churchill famously said, he was never quite right, Churchill, about these things, but he was close. He said, before Alamein, never a victory. After Alamein, never a defeat. And that's, as Meghan was saying, it became a sort of a pendulum swing after Alamein that went through Tunis and Sicily and Italy. And then, of course, the great creation of the invasion of Normandy. And that was in a sense, the apotheosis of the Grand Alliance. That was the culmination of the Grand Alliance, D-Day, and the invasion of Normandy. And after that, there could be no discussion about how the war would end. The war would end with the complete defeat of Germany. Once they got to the bridgeheads at the end of D-Day on the 6th of June, then they all knew how the war would eventually end. They just didn't know how long it would take.
So Meghan, take us back to that moment. Once those troops landed in France, what then?
Well, you then have, as Mike said, you're crossing across Western Europe more generally, and the landing operations are part of that wider invasion. And this begins with the liberation of France and later the rest of Western Europe, and laid the foundations, as was mentioned, of the Allied victory. We have 24,000 American, British and Canadian troops landing following an early morning aerial assault. And, German D-Day casualties on that day itself were estimated between 4,000 and 9,000. And this is also including, going back slightly, significant deception plans. And I think that's a testament to the work of the intelligence forces that the Allies had, including things like Operation Bodyguard, which were designed to mislead Germans as to the date and location of the Allied landings, which was really crucial. And then we see, of course, things like Operation Market Garden, and as we're heading towards there, including the liberation of Rome and places like that. I think all of those things are significant, and then that race to Berlin culminating that element.
And Mike, what was the Allied grand strategy here?
Well, it consisted of two things in broad terms. One was a gradual moving in on the Third Reich. I mean, Eisenhower had this strategy of moving across the whole front in unison, as it were, with all of the Allies, gradually moving in. Montgomery, of course, wanted to dash over the Rhine, which is what he tried in Operation Market Garden, a sort of a quick strike and get into Germany as fast as possible. But Eisenhower's strategy, and we know, of course, Market Garden didn't work, and Eisenhower's strategy was just to keep the pressure moving, to move slowly but surely onto the Third Reich. That's what they did. And the other element of the strategy was unconditional surrender. There was to be no separate peace in the West. I mean, the Germans were always their offensive in the Ardennes at Christmas in 1944 was really an attempt to shock the Allies in the West into making a separate peace, and they never would. The idea was unconditional surrender. After the First World War and all the myths of the stab in the back of 1918 and so on, the great lie that had persisted for years, a bit like a great lie about stolen elections. If you say it often enough people believe it. There was to be none of that again. And so the Allies would insist on unconditional surrender. You surrender always, everywhere, all at once, and then we will sit down and talk about what happens next. And that was a really important part of a joint Allied strategy that kept all of the Western Allies together.
And Meghan, how much was air power part of this phase of the war?
I think it was a crucial part. As I mentioned, we had the airborne element as part of D-Day in terms of, landing prior to the seaborne invasion and things like that. But you also have elements of things like strategic bombing campaigns being very significant in that alliance winning the war. And I think as well, it's important to note, we have the Royal Air Force working alongside its allies to carry out these aspects of the warfare that was significant for VE Day.
And of course, it's worth noting Germany was fighting on two fronts, Russia to the east and us to the west. We were able to concentrate on one front, having already won in North Africa, and then on Italy's home turf. Mike, what was the strategic thinking behind even getting into the fight in North Africa? Did it matter, or was it a distraction?
No, originally it mattered a great deal to fight in North Africa because, Rommel and the Africa Corps were pushing towards Cairo. They've been pushing across North Africa. And if they had taken Cairo, and they nearly did, incidentally, in Alexandria, the embassy was burning papers. People were moving out into Palestine. Civilians were moving out. The Navy pulled out of Alexandria to get the ships out of the way. There was a widespread expectation before Alamein in October 1942 that Cairo would fall. And the point about that is that if the Germans could kick the British and the Commonwealth forces out of the Middle East, with Hitler invading Russia, it would be logical for Hitler then to move into the Caucasus and to move into Iran, Persia, and join up with the liberation, from their point of view, of the Middle East. And then they might even join up with Japan, who is planning to actually invade India. And the idea of Hitler and the Emperor of Japan having a handshake somewhere on the North Indian border was a very real possibility seemed a very real possibility in 1942. So actually preventing that happening was strategically extremely important. And the defense of Cairo, the fact that Cairo didn't fall and at least dug in and then was the center for the fight back in North Africa, that itself was extremely important.
And Meghan, what about Italy? Was that a strategic decision to close that down before going into France, or just how the cards fell?
I think it's a mix of those two factors. We, of course, have to make sure that we're not necessarily fighting on those two fronts, because that can make things significantly difficult in terms of personnel power and other resources. But it's also an element of how the cards fell. There was a significant fighting across Sicily and later mainland Italy that were incredibly significant to that victory.
And Meghan, back to the advance on Germany, at what point did our momentum reach critical mass?
I think, as Mike said, towards that sort of early part of 1945, the German forces were starting to see that, this is potentially a war that they're not going to win. They're fighting on two fronts, and they can see that there is significant work. Of course, there was air and naval superiority on the Allies' side. And I think as well, as we're sort of heading up towards the events that Mike outlined in the run-up to VE Day, there's that knowledge that it's going to come sometime soon. It's a case of when, not if anymore.
So, Mike, what did we get right on the way and what did we get wrong?
Very interesting question. I think, what the Allies got right in tactical terms was combined arms. So the ability to fight air and land together. Meghan knows this better than the rest of us, that the integration of air power, particularly close air support, was really important, as indeed was attacking the logistics of the German forces. They certainly got all of that right. What did they get wrong? Well, probably some of the politics of it as they were moving forward. Although they stuck to unconditional surrender, there was some naivety in what they thought the end result would be, because unconditional surrender meant that you just kept fighting and you didn't worry about the political situation that was developing behind the front line. And a lot of people blame the Western Allies, a lot of people in Eastern Europe who then fell under, Russian or Soviet domination. They blame the Western Allies for not being more politically savvy as they were moving forward. But we just refused to really think about the politics that would follow the war until the war was over, until that moment arrived on the 8th of May, and we could say, OK, now it's done. And there was no real planning. Even the big conferences at Tehran and then Yalta in February 45, and then Potsdam, of course, in July, those big conferences really didn't settle the political future of Europe, and it left a legacy of many, many problems that we lived with for the next two generations. Because getting the war won on the ground militarily at the time, that seemed overwhelmingly the most important objective.
I completely agree with what Mike was saying. You know, that alliance building was significant, of course, D-Day and the liberation of Europe more generally. As I mentioned previously, that intelligence and deception aspect in terms of breaking the German codes and running deception operations cannot be overstated. And in terms of the sort of less successful elements, notwithstanding the early campaign failures that we see earlier in the Second World War, the delayed opening of the Western Front could arguably been a failure in terms of supporting allies, although, as we can see, that it led to that victory by having that slight delay. And in terms of, as Mike said, that post-war planning, there wasn't really anything in place. And so that's where the Cold War then comes in.
So when and how was victory sealed, Meghan?
That's a broad question. I think it's that case of in building that sustainment as we go into the run up to VE Day. I should highlight, of course, that as Winston Churchill outlines in his speech on VE Day, you know, the war isn't completely won. We still are fighting in the Far East, and that's when VJ Day comes in August. But largely, it's an element of in the run up to these various victories and getting closer and closer to crossing the line. That's when it's important.
Mike, did we win or did Germany lose? And how much credit should we give to Russia?
We should give enormous credit to Russia because 80% of German losses were on the Eastern Front. And the Eastern Front had no comparison in terms of the suffering to what was happening for us on the Western Front. So the USSR, the Soviet Union, lost about 24 million people, about 10 million civilians, about 10 to 14 million military, but military and civilian all became mixed in their pushback. And it was a huge, huge campaign. And of course, the Russians have been rewriting that history ever since. And famously, they will be reenacting tomorrow the taking of the Reichstag, this famous moment where 2 Soviet soldiers climbed onto the roof of the Reichstag and raised the flag. And do you know who those soldiers were? The first one was a man called Alexei Benest, and he was a Ukrainian. And the man with him was a Georgian. And you won't be hearing that in Moscow tomorrow.
I bet.
The man who raised the flag on the Reichstag was a Ukrainian soldier of the Soviet Union. But there it is. The war went the way it went because the numbers that the Russians put into it and the suffering on the Eastern Front dwarfs anything that happened to us on the Western Front. Without the Western Front, the war wouldn't have been won, but without the Eastern Front, the war wouldn't have been won. But it was deeply disproportionate in the savagery and the costs with which the war was fought, which is one reason why the Germans were desperate to surrender to the Western Allies and not be taken by the Russians as the Russians moved in on Berlin.
So before we consider the lessons that we should be drawing 80 years on, we should remember that despite how it felt for the citizens of Europe, even with the fall of Nazi Germany, as we've heard, the war still had to be won.
Let us not forget for a moment, Japan, with all her treachery and greed, remains unsubdued. We must now devote all our strength and resources to the completion of our task.
Well, let's talk now to military historian Lucy Betteridge-Dyson. Her new book focuses down on the war in the Far East, which continued for months after victory had been achieved in Europe. Lucy, welcome back to Sitrep. Great to see you again. Just give us the big picture. Who was still fighting, where, and at what scale after VE Day?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is such an important point to remember. The war in the Far East, and actually, even in parts of Europe, the war didn't instantly stop. You know, soldiers were still in action. And in the Far East, more so than ever, because Japan weren't the kind of enemy that was going to hang up their boots just because the Nazis had surrendered. And they were all in at this point. They had nothing left to lose. So actually, the fighting in the Far East around this time was probably some of the most ferocious fighting that the war had seen in that region. Particularly if we look at VE Day itself, we had Okinawa, you know, the Americans fighting in Okinawa, one of the most vicious engagements in the Pacific campaign. And then for the British, Indian, Commonwealth troops, the fighting was continuing in Burma as they battled towards Rangoon, and with my own grandfather involved in Arakan in that region of Burma as well. So there was an awful lot still going on, and probably some of the most vicious fighting of the period, actually.
Why so vicious when you talk about the British troops there in Burma?
Well, there was a number of reasons, particularly at this stage, because the Japanese had nothing left to lose. They put everything into this. And so with their ideology, the Bushido warrior code behind them, they were fighting to the death, essentially. And I think the other thing to remember is that in the environment in Burma, they had the monsoon season on the kind of doorstep, May, June time. So there was a rush to kind of finish this fighting one way or another before that hit from both sides.
And Lucy, what was the state of the overall Far East conflict? Was there any sense of who had the upper hand or momentum at this point?
I think that's difficult to answer. I mean, that kind of comes back to the question of whether the atomic bombings were necessary. There's kind of counterfactual history here. As far as the troops on the ground were concerned, morale was high, and certainly news of V-Day was a morale boost. But the day-to-day fighting was continuing, and there was it wasn't a given that they were going to be winning for sure.
And you say morale was high with the news of VE Day. Did the victory in Europe change anything, either on the battlefield or in thinking at the highest levels?
I think the big impact of it was the fact that obviously the war in the Far East for the Allies, particularly for the British, had come as a secondary theatre with the Germany First policy. With the Nazi surrender, that freed up a lot of Allied resources to be pushed towards the war in the Far East. But that wasn't an instantaneous change. That took time. Apart from that, and the morale boost, there wasn't a huge kind of on-the-ground difference because of what happened in Europe, no.
Just interested to pick up on something you said a bit earlier, that there has been different interpretations of the history in that was the atom bomb absolutely necessary. Can you talk me through the different versions?
Well, there's one version that says the atom bomb was needed because Japan was never going to surrender, essentially, and that they needed the Japanese, who were obviously led by their emperor, that there was no other reason that they would give in, and that the devastation of the atom bomb was the catalyst to the surrender. The other version goes that actually Japan was already on the back foot. It was running out of resources, and it would have surrendered anyway at a given time, probably in the not so distant future, whether that was September, whether that was October, but certainly in the near future. And it's a very difficult question to answer because we don't know what might have happened if those bombs hadn't been dropped.
Indeed. And it's so often called the forgotten war. You share veteran stories in your new book, Jungle Commandos, The Battle for Arakan, Burma, 1945. And as you said earlier, your own grandfather was part of that campaign. How hard was it for them to still be at the front line while everyone back home was celebrating the end of the war, as it felt to them?
Oh my God, it was hugely difficult for most people. I mean, I remember my grandfather, the big thing for him was that actually he didn't get back to the UK until 1947. So, and at that point in the UK, things were sort of back to normal. People were going about their day-to-day lives. The war in Europe for them was behind them for 2 years. But in the Far East, there was much more work to be done even after Japan's surrender. So the commandos were sent to Hong Kong. So my grandfather went there for peacekeeping duties. There was a lot of tidying up to do. Of course, we had the devastation of the prisoner of war camps and those discoveries, those Japanese atrocities, and having to kind of process all of that. And by the time many of the veterans got back to Britain, there was no flag waving, waiting their ships. There was nothing. My granddad got off the troop ship, had to get a ticket at the station and make his way home. And that was it. And that was an awful lot to come to terms with, I think.
Yeah. And did you get a sense of how it affected him?
Yeah, I mean, the term the Forgotten Army and the Forgotten Front is something that I struggle with sometimes because I do think there's a lot of great work being done to bring attention to it. But that's how he felt, for sure. He's told me as much when he was alive. And many of the veterans, when you look at their feelings after the war, they felt in a way betrayed, I would say, in some respects. And my granddad said one thing that always stays with me in an interview for something he did for the BBC. He said, maybe that was the price we had to pay for so-called freedom. And it was just tinged with this, so-called freedom. And I think that encompasses that kind of slight bitterness, I would say, towards the lack of reception that they had. Not that they ever regretted what they did and they were very proud of it, but just this idea that people were continuing their lives as normal and they'd been toiling for a further 2 years out there.
Lucy Betteridge-Dyson, it's been great speaking to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, this was a world war, fought on the ground in 3 continents, in the air above 4, and of course in all of the oceans in between. Meghan, this perhaps is the most important lesson. How did it become that from the invasion of Poland?
Gosh, that's a whole other episode in some ways. You know, how much time do we have? I think, you know, as I mentioned previously, you know, we're starting out with the so-called phony war from British perspectives. Of course, it's less of a phony war in places like Poland at this time. And as part of that, we see that migration of people to support the war effort as countries in Europe fell. Firstly with places like Czechoslovakia and Poland, and then later France, Belgium and places like that. And, you know, some of these people come to Britain and fight, particularly from my perspective, from an Air Force perspective, in the Battle of Britain. And we're also looking at things like the defeats in Norway, Greece and Crete. So Norway in 1940, Greece and Crete in 1941. And then we have that change, as Mike outlined, with things like El Alamein and of course the Battle of Britain, and that tide shift. And then we head towards that crossing into Western Europe, starting with D-Day and Operation Husky, and then moving into what we've been discussing today.
And Mike, when you look at the world today, Russia, Ukraine, Israel, Gaza, this week, India, Pakistan, have we learnt enough to be able to stop those becoming the same kind of catalyst for a global war?
Well, I don't know if we ever learn enough, but I don't think they are the catalyst of a global war because, I mean, the global wars of 1914 and then 1939 were global for different reasons. So the First World War became global because the European empires, because the empires were fighting in Europe, they therefore fought throughout their empires. And for that reason, it was effectively a global war. And then in the Second World War, it was a series of ideologies. The fight was between a group of ideologies, the Liberal Democrats countries, effectively leading a movement against the fascist countries and the highly autocratic countries. So that was a global war because it was ideological. The issues we have now are all wars for different reasons, but there's nothing that unites them. There's nothing that actually makes them into one sort of war. It's often said, you know, that the historians in the future will look at on the 20th century and they'll talk about the long war, the war that started in 1914 and didn't finish until 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. The whole of the 20th century will be seen as the long war, and that's one way of looking at it. But what we see now are a series of disorders because that long war gave us an international system which has now collapsed or is in a state of collapse, as we've talked on this programme quite a lot in the last couple of years. And in the absence of a powerful international system, conflict breaks out elsewhere, but they're not united either by empires or by ideology or by underlying causes for all of them. They all have separate causes. So we live in a world of great disorder, but not a world, I think, that is sliding towards World War III.
Well, arguably, the most important thing we must do to learn and be able to apply the lessons from World War II is to remember, as we are doing this week, 80 years on.
It's another magnificent day. It's a national day. It's a piece of our pageantry. But we've got people from the Royal Navy, Royal Air Force, the British Army, but they're accompanied by contingents from Ukraine, from our NATO allies, and also from Commonwealth countries.
For me, it's a big honor to participate in this parade, like a part of free world, and to represent our nation, our military, who are the worst condition on the front line, fighting for our freedom, for our life, for our existence.
This is your hour. This is not a victory of a party or of any class. It's a victory of the great British nation as a whole.
No one does it like the British. We've all heard that before, haven't we? And we are all custodians of delivering that reputation.
My dad fought in the war, so we thought we'd come just to sort of remember those things that he did.
It was great. We had our little stools to stand on so we could see all the bands, we were waving our flags.
We have to remember things like this, hopefully to learn for the future.
Meghan, what are the most important lessons for today from World War II and the Allied victory in your view?
Again, that's a really broad question. And I think, as was outlined in those interviews that you had, they're so individual. And that's something that I'm really passionate about in my area of history, which is that memory study and commemorative aspect. I think there's not a one-size-fits-all approach. But for me personally, I think it is that element of, we had, as Mike described it, potentially that war across the 20th century. But we also have that element of the various aspects that kind of this Second World War enables so many different people to become interested in it. And I think that's why it is, so prolific in our memory and understanding, whether that's visiting places like the National Arboretum or the RAF Museum, where I'm sat currently, to attend events there, right down to those personal approaches of remembering family members, like Lucy mentioning her grandfather. I appreciate he was out in the Far East, but, other family members there. And I think that's really important. It's that remembering what happened, and the classic saying of never again hopefully does stand.
And Mike, what do you think? What are the most important lessons?
If I had to draw one lesson from it, it's a question of costs and prevention. Anthony Beaver, the eminent historian, he reckons that the Second World War cost 85 million deaths, both war deaths and directly related civilian deaths, 85 million. And one of the lessons of a global war like that, or any industrial society war where the whole of industrial society gears up to fight, is that the costs are enormous and the benefits of prevention are huge. And when we look back at the Second World War with its 85 million deaths, and we think about all of the things that might have happened between 1935 and 1939 that might have prevented it, and when we think about that now, we think about the trouble of prevention, the risks of prevention, whatever they are infinitely smaller than the trouble and the risks and the costs of major wars. That's a simple, unending lesson of the Second World War to me.
Mike, do you think we should write up the Allied strategy, which ended in victory, and keep it on file marked winning, or is that a fool's errand?
Well, I think we can mark it as prevailing. The Allies prevailed because, by the end of the war, the collective GDP of the Western Allies was $2 trillion. $2,000 billion, and the collective GDP of the Axis powers was $560 billion. So the Allied powers were 4 times richer than the Axis powers by the time the Axis was overcome. They were overwhelmed. They were beaten on the battlefield as well, but fundamentally they were overwhelmed by the industrial power of the United States, of Russia and Britain.
Of course, the old saying goes, winning the peace can be harder than winning the war. Meghan, we mentioned earlier those top-level meetings in Yalta and Tehran. How prepared were we for securing the peace, and how much did it just evolve?
I think it's a mix of the two. I think, as with any of these meetings, you have to go in with an element of flexibility, because you never know what your allies might significantly want. And we can see that through the evolution of what was being negotiated in terms of how the landscape of Europe would look in terms of those reconstructed countries in particular. But I think there is an element of making sure you go in with certain hard lines of what you're not going to negotiate or settle for. And I think it's really fascinating when you look at the consistent policies that are coming in particularly in Yalta and Tehran, and then later Potsdam. And then, of course, as anyone who has studied the Cold War at school and things like that, they'll see that, that starts those origins of the Cold War, arguably.
And Mike, it gave us the United Nations, NATO followed. Also, as Meghan just said, the Soviet Union and the Cold War. Although both of those are consigned to history now, how does that peace-winning strategy look to you with the benefit of 80 years of hindsight?
Well, with the significant exception of the Cold War, which is shameful in a way, but was probably impossible to prevent in some way or other, the post-war settlement looked pretty good because it was a political settlement. The United Nations was quite important. NATO was very important. So was the economic system based on the Bretton Woods arrangements and the creation of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. It gave us a historically unique system, which is a Western system. It only applied in the West, but the West was the dominant feature of global politics after 1945. And it looked so good that we took it for granted. And it didn't come under real pressure until the late 1970s. And then it didn't begin to unravel until after the beginning of this 21st century. So, when we think about what was created after the Second World War, it was really very good. And probably it's hard to think of any other historical period like the Congress of Vienna after the Napoleonic Wars in 1815. That created a system that was pretty good, but it wasn't as good as the post-1945 one. You think about the Treaty of Westphalia, 1648, that created a whole system in Europe. That was pretty good as well, but none of them were as good as the post-1945 one. And as we are losing touch with that system now, only now, I think, are we appreciating the foresight of some of the people who put that together and the effort that was made to get military, political, economic and moral arrangements all heading in the same direction. And that lasted for 2 generations. And only now is it become impossible to maintain.
And Meghan, if I can just get a final thought from you, what do you think the greatest misunderstanding we have of World War II is, and how can we correct that?
I think something that Lucy outlined in what she was saying earlier in terms of, war doesn't end. It might end slightly in Europe, but on the 8th of May. But, we have to look at the full picture. And something that I always say when I'm giving presentations is sometimes it's very difficult to actually definitively say when a war ends, particularly if you speak to other countries. And I think that's the misunderstanding. I think when we look at the Second World War, we need to look at it in full and expand that knowledge more generally.
And Mike, given the relative peace for us in the last 80 years, it would seem the people who lived it in World War II learned the lessons. I just wonder if some lessons can only be truly learned by first-hand experience.
Yeah, I mean, every era makes its own mistakes. Every era learns its own lessons, and history, of course, as we say, never repeats itself. But, the great English historian, Edward Gibbon, who wrote about the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, magisterial work of great historical sweep. And he said that history is no more than the register of the crimes, the follies and the misfortunes of mankind. It's a kind of nihilistic view, the crimes, follies and misfortunes. That's what history is. Well, I take a more Whig history view, a Whiggish view of history, which that I think history can be seen as a progression towards something better, but it goes in mysterious ways. But I do believe that human civilization is basically moving in positive directions. But my goodness, we don't have to take some missteps on the way.
Mike, I'm going for your version. Professor Michael Clarke, Dr Meghan Kellegher, thank you both so much. Mike and I will be back with another Sitrep next Thursday. In the meantime, you can stay up to date with all the latest defence news on our website, forcesnews.com. For now, though, from me, Kate Chabot, thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.